December 29, 1890. The frozen plains of South Dakota. A column of Lakota men, women, and children moves slowly through the snow, exhausted, starving, wrapped in whatever scraps of cloth they could carry. Their leader, Chief Bigfoot, lies in a wagon, running a fever so high he can barely lift his head. They are not warriors on the march. They are survivors trying to reach safety. Around them, nearly 500 heavily armed U.S. soldiers close in from every direction. What happens next is something the U.S. government would take over a century to formally apologize for, and what many historians consider one of the darkest chapters in American history. But here is the question almost nobody asks. How did it come to this? How did one of the most powerful, most fiercely independent nations on the continent end up cornered in the snow at a place called Wounded Knee? And what does their world look like today? Welcome to Frontier Uncensored. I'm your host, Dustin, and today we are going deep inside the story of the Lakota Sioux. From the height of their power on the open plains, to the brutal reality of reservation life, to what their community looks like right now. If this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell, because this is the kind of history they never taught you in school. Let's go back to the beginning. Before the reservations, before the broken treaties, before any of it, the Lakota were a force of nature. They were the westernmost branch of the Great Sioux Nation, a vast confederation of tribes that stretched across the northern Great Plains. The word Lakota itself means friends or allies. The name Sioux, which outsiders applied to them, comes from a shortened version of a term used by rival tribes. But make no mistake, the Lakota defined themselves on their own terms. They were horsemen, hunters, and warriors of extraordinary skill. When horses arrived on the plains in the 1700s, the Lakota adapted with remarkable speed, building an entire culture around the animal. A skilled Lakota rider could fire arrows at full gallop with accuracy that left even experienced military men stunned. Their knowledge of the land, the movement of bison herds, the patterns of weather and terrain, gave them a strategic advantage that few outsiders could match. For generations, they were the dominant power on the northern plains, respected and feared by neighboring tribes and encroaching settlers alike. Their social structure was built around the Tiospy, the extended family unit. This wasn't just a cultural preference. It was a system of survival, mutual obligation, and identity. Your Tiospy was your safety net, your court of justice, your spiritual community. It was everything, and understanding that word, Tiospy, will matter a great deal before this story is over. But here is the thing that never gets asked enough. If the Lakota were so powerful, so well organized, so deeply rooted in their land, then how exactly did it all unravel? What was the mechanism? What was the turning point? The answer is a document, a piece of paper signed in 1868 at Fort Laramie, Wyoming. The Fort Laramie Treaty was on its face one of the most generous agreements the U.S. government had ever offered to an indigenous nation. It recognized Lakota sovereignty over a vast territory, including the Black Hills of South Dakota, the Pahasapa, a place so sacred to the Lakota that translating its spiritual significance into English barely scratches the surface. The treaty was supposed to end the years of violent conflict that had erupted as settlers and railroad crews pushed west. And for a moment, it looked like it might hold. Then, in 1874, Lieutenant Colonel George Custer led an expedition into the Black Hills, officially for scientific purposes. What his team found changed everything. Gold. Within months, thousands of prospectors were flooding into territory the United States had legally agreed belonged to the Lakota. The government's response was not to enforce the treaty. It was to try to buy the Black Hills. When the Lakota refused, the U.S. Army was ordered to force all Lakota bands onto reservations by January 31st, 1876. Any who refused would be considered hostile. Most bands could not have complied, even if they wanted to. The distances were too great, the winter too brutal, the deadline too short, so the Army moved anyway. What followed was the Black Hills War, and it produced one of the most stunning military upsets of the entire frontier era. In June of 1876, at a river the Lakota called the Greasy Grass, and the Army called the Little Bighorn, a coalition of Lakota and Cheyenne warriors, led by Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, and others surrounded and overwhelmed a detachment of the U.S. 7th Cavalry. Custer and over 200 of his men met their fate in a matter of hours. It was the most decisive Native American military victory of the 19th century. But here is what that victory actually cost them, because this is the part the triumphant retellings always leave out. The Battle of Little Bighorn did not save the Lakota. It sealed their fate. The public outcry in the eastern United States was immediate and ferocious. The Army poured resources into the Plains campaign. Band after band was hunted down, exhausted, and forced to surrender. Sitting Bull fled to Canada. Crazy Horse eventually surrendered and was later taken out under circumstances that remain disputed to this day. The great coalition that had humiliated the U.S. Army at the greasy grass was scattered within a year, and then the legal mechanisms went to work. The Dawes Act of 1887 was framed as a reform, a humanitarian measure designed to help Native Americans assimilate into American society. What it actually did was break up communally held tribal lands into individual allotments and open the remaining land to white settlement. For the Lakota, the act was catastrophic. The Great Sioux reservations, established by the 1868 treaty, was dissolved. The Lakota were confined to 6 smaller, separate reservations. Millions of acres were stripped away. The land base that had sustained their way of life for generations was gone, which brings us back to that frozen morning in December 1890, and the place called Wounded Knee Creek. By the winter of 1890, the Lakota were desperate. Their bison herds, the foundation of their economy and their culture, had been systematically wiped out, partly by commercial hunters and partly as a deliberate government strategy. Rations promised under treaty agreements were routinely cut. Hunger was widespread. Into this despair came a spiritual movement called the Ghost Dance, which promised that if the people danced and prayed, the world would be restored, the dead would return, the settlers would disappear, the bison would come back. It spread through reservations like wildfire. The U.S. government panicked. Agents reported that the Ghost Dance was a precursor to an uprising. The Army was mobilized. Sitting Bull, by then returned from Canada and seen as a potential figurehead for resistance, was taken out during an attempted arrest at Standing Rock in December 1890. Chief Bigfoot's band was already on the move when soldiers intercepted them. They were escorted to a camp at Wounded Knee Creek. The next morning, while soldiers attempted to disarm the group, a shot was fired. Accounts differ on who fired it and why. What is not disputed is what happened next. Artillery opened up on a camp filled with women, children, and elders. Within minutes, somewhere between 150 and 300 Lakota had perished. Their bodies were later gathered and placed in a mass grave by hired civilians. The U.S. Army awarded 20 soldiers the Medal of Honor for their actions that day. Many of those medals have never been rescinded. Here is where I want you to sit with a question, and we'll come back to the answer. If the federal government officially recognized the Lakota's right to their land, signed a treaty guaranteeing it, and then systematically violated every provision of that treaty, what does that mean for the legal and moral status of the Black Hills today? Hold that thought. We are not done. After Wounded Knee, the reservation era began in earnest, and one of the most insidious tools of this era was not a weapon, it was a school. Beginning with President Ulysses Grant's so-called peace policy, in 1869, the U.S. government mandated the enrollment of indigenous children in Christian boarding schools. The philosophy behind these institutions was stated plainly by their founder, Colonel Richard Pratt. Kill the Indian, save the man. Children were taken from their families, sometimes by force. They were forbidden to speak their languages, practice their spiritual traditions, or use their native names. The schools persisted well into the 20th century. A 2007 Amnesty International investigation documented what generations of survivors had been saying for decades. These children endured forced assimilation, grueling physical labor, and widespread physical and sexual abuse. The trauma did not stay within the walls of those schools. It traveled home with the survivors, and it traveled down through generations. Researchers studying indigenous communities today use the term intergenerational trauma, and the evidence for it is not theoretical. It is measurable. Look at the numbers coming out of the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, and they will stop you cold. Pine Ridge sits in the southwest corner of South Dakota, home to the Oglala Lakota, a subtribe of the Lakota Sioux. It covers 2.2 million acres, roughly the size of Connecticut. 30,000 to 40,000 people call it home, and by almost every measurable standard of well-being, it ranks among the most challenging places to live in the entire United States. Unemployment sits at around 80 to 85%. Median individual income, as of data collected in the mid-2000s, was approximately $4,000 per year. More than half the population of the largest county on the reservation lives below the federal poverty line. Life expectancy at Pine Ridge is the second lowest in the Western Hemisphere. The only region ranking below it is Haiti. Rates of diabetes and tuberculosis run 8 times higher than the national average. Cervical cancer risk is 5 times the U.S. norm. More than 80% of the population has been affected by alcohol in some form. These are not abstract statistics. These are conditions that shape every dimension of daily life, from the food people eat, to the quality of sleep they get, to whether a child has a working heater in January. And here is where the economics get particularly brutal. There are no banks on Pine Ridge. Because all reservation land is held in trust by the United States government, residents cannot use their property as collateral to secure loans. Think about what that means for a moment. You live on land your people have occupied for generations. The federal government technically controls it. You cannot mortgage it. You cannot use it to start a business. You are locked out of the most basic mechanisms of capital formation that every other American takes for granted. An organization called the Lakota Fund was established in 1986 specifically to address this barrier. Modeled on the Grameen Bank of Bangladesh, it offered small non-collateral loans to groups of borrowers who would hold each other accountable. But even this innovative approach ran into a problem rooted in culture. The Grameen model prohibited family members from being in the same credit group. In Lakota culture, the Teospe, the extended family unit we discussed earlier, is the fundamental unit of trust and mutual obligation. You were being asked to build financial accountability with strangers in a culture where accountability flows through family. The Lakota Fund was eventually dissolved in 1996. The lesson it left behind is one that development experts still debate. Economic solutions that ignore cultural architecture tend to collapse. What does daily life actually look like on Pine Ridge? Let's be honest about it, because the picture is complicated in ways that don't fit neatly into either a tragedy narrative or an inspirational one. Housing on the reservation is severely overcrowded. Extended families share homes built for far fewer people. Many homes lack reliable running water or electricity. Infrastructure maintenance is chronically underfunded. Roads that are impassable in winter cut communities off from health care, groceries, and emergency services. Broadband internet access, which most Americans now treat as a utility as basic as running water, remains limited across much of the reservation, creating an additional layer of isolation. The school system faces a shortage of qualified teachers. Educational materials are often outdated. Dropout rates are high. The cycle is self-reinforcing. Poverty limits educational opportunity, and limited education constrains the economic options available to the next generation. Alcohol is the most visible and most discussed symptom of this systemic collapse. Over 50% of the community struggles with alcohol dependency. Alcohol-related fatality rates run 300% above the national average. More than a quarter of all babies born on Pine Ridge are affected by fetal alcohol syndrome or related conditions. But researchers who have studied this carefully, including Nick Estes, a scholar of indigenous history, push back hard against any framing that treats alcoholism as a cultural failing. The psychology of poverty literature is clear on this point. When people face conditions of chronic deprivation and hopelessness, behaviors that numb that pain become less costly in psychological terms. Alcohol, in this context, is not a cause of poverty. It is a response to it. A response to the destruction of traditional social structures, the suppression of belief systems, the breakdown of the Teospai, and generations of unresolved grief. The border town of White Clay, Nebraska, located just outside Pine Ridge, became notorious for decades as the primary supply point for alcohol flowing onto the reservation, despite the reservation itself being officially dry. At its peak, the town had 4 beer stores, generating millions in sales annually, serving a population of fewer than 15 people who actually lived there. The rest of the sales were going to Pine Ridge. The Nebraska Liquor Commission finally revoked those licenses in 2017, after decades of community activism. Here is the question I want you to sit with before we get to the ending. Given everything you have just heard, given the treaties broken, the land taken, the schools, the massacres, the structural barriers built into law itself, do you think the challenges on Pine Ridge today are a product of individual choices, or are they the predictable output of a 200-year system? I genuinely want to know what you think. Drop your answer in the comments, because this is exactly the kind of question that gets buried when we sanitize history. Now, let's talk about what is still alive, because in the middle of everything I just described, something remarkable persists. The Lakota language is still spoken on Pine Ridge, preserved through community programs, taught by elders to children who would otherwise never hear it. The language encodes an entire worldview, a relationship to time, to kinship, to the land, that does not translate into English. Losing it would mean losing something that cannot be reconstructed from any archive. Powwows and cultural gatherings continue to draw community members together, celebrating traditional music, dance, and art forms that survived despite every effort to eradicate them. Sacred sites across the reservation remain central to ceremony and spiritual practice. The Oglala Lakota's connection to the land is not merely sentimental, it is theological. The land is not a resource to be managed. It is a living relative. Grassroots organizations and tribal leadership have launched initiatives targeting youth development, health education, economic self-sufficiency, and cultural revitalization. Some of these efforts have gained national attention. Partnerships with universities, nonprofits, and outside advocates have brought resources and visibility to the reservation. None of it is enough on its own, but the direction matters. And then there is the legal question that has never gone away. The Black Hills case is one of the longest-running legal disputes in American history. In 1980, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in United States v. Sioux Nation of Indians that the federal government had illegally seized the Black Hills in violation of the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty. The court awarded $102 million in compensation. The Lakota refused to accept it. They did not want money. They wanted their land back. That settlement, with nearly a century of interest accumulated, now sits in a federal account worth well over $1 billion. The Lakota have refused to touch it. For many in the community, accepting the money would be tantamount to selling a birthplace, selling something that cannot be priced. The legal and moral argument they are making is actually straightforward. A court already agreed the land was taken illegally. The question of remedy has simply never been answered in a way the Lakota find acceptable. Nick Estes frames it this way: you cannot understand the poverty on Pine Ridge without understanding that it is not a random misfortune. It is the direct, traceable result of specific decisions, specific laws, specific acts of violence carried out over 200 years. The poverty is not an accident of history. It is its outcome. And if the outcome was engineered, then undoing it requires more than charity. It requires reckoning, which brings us all the way back to that frozen morning at Wounded Knee. Chief Bigfoot's people were not hostile combatants. They were not preparing an attack. They were a starving group of men, women, and children trying to reach safety at a moment when the world they had known for centuries had been stripped down to almost nothing. The ghost dance that had so alarmed the U.S. Army was not a military strategy. It was a prayer born of desperation, asking for a world that had already been taken. What happened at Wounded Knee Creek on December 29th, 1890, was not a battle. It was the violent punctuation mark at the end of a deliberate, decades-long campaign to erase a people from their land. And the echoes of that morning still shape what life looks like on Pine Ridge today, in unemployment numbers, in health statistics, in children who grow up without running water. 2 hours from Mount Rushmore, a monument carved into hills that a federal court already ruled were stolen. The Lakota are still here. The language is still spoken. The ceremonies still happen. The T-Spy still holds people together when everything else falls apart. That is not a small thing. After everything this community has endured, the fact that its culture is alive and fighting is one of the most striking acts of resilience in American history. But resilience should not be confused with justice, and the difference between those two words is where this story is still being written. If this episode made you think, or if you knew parts of this history that surprised you, tell us in the comments. What do you think the United States owes the Lakota Sioux? What would accountability actually look like? There are no easy answers, but the conversation matters. And if you are new here, subscribe and hit the bell. We cover the stories that shaped this continent, the ones that got buried, the ones that complicate the simple narratives, the ones that deserve more than a footnote. This is Frontier Uncensored. I'm Dustin. We'll see you in the next one.